Hello again, everyone. This is my second mini lecture for week 3, where I am talking about expulsive zoning and providing just some context definitionally to what expulsive zoning is, how it operates as a process, and what some of its impacts can be in the context of, particularly in the context of environmental justice issues and racial discrimination. Following that, I want to provide kind of a case study of cities in Ohio, and in particular Columbus, to talk about the process of redlining. Now, all of you are very aware of what redlining is. I'm quite certain about that, and we've seen more and more kind of public dialogue around redlining. But I want to kind of dive into the context of what were some of the factors that really drove assessment decisions with the redlining maps that were created and the neighborhood grades that were applied, and also to look at kind of the diversity in neighborhood types that were downgraded in the context of redlining, and how those communities kind of dealt with those challenges in the aftermath of the 1930s. So as we move into our discussion, I referenced expulsive zoning in our Euclid mini presentation for week 3. I want to go a little bit deeper and just kind of talk about what expulsive zoning is and how it still has an influence in the context of, in particular, environmental justice issues in the city, as well as just overall kind of quality of life issues in neighborhoods. So kind of using Jessica Johnstein's definition from segregation by design, expulsive zoning is a practice of citing industrial, semi-industrial, or other nuisances in neighborhoods of color to both preserve white neighborhoods and induce Black movement into particular parts of the city. As a process, we have to recognize that expulsive zoning is something that happens very slowly over time. And it's an accumulative process of various kind of planning and zoning decisions that begin to create a very kind of unequal landscape in the context of, in particular, where industrial manufacturing and other more kind of very problematic land uses are. And again, I'm going to paraphrase, very long quote here, so I won't read the whole quote, but I'll paraphrase. And this is from Bradley Poe's article on neighborhood upzoning and racial displacement. Imagine over time, then after a city incorporates, it wants to diversify its tax base, and it is already racially segregated. So it'll allocate some land for industrial uses to diversify the tax base, but this raises the question of where those industrial uses or more those intense land uses and that upzoning is going to happen. And as Poe notes here, the city has to put new industrial land somewhere, and white neighborhoods have more political capital to organize and keep these land uses out of their neighborhoods. Therefore, cities are kind of left then to kind of target communities of color in particular, or racial and ethnic communities and lower income communities for these industrial uses, right? Producing in the long term then an accumulation of highly pollutant kind of land uses in these racial and ethnic residential areas, which then has a long-term impact in terms of just the quality of life and also health risk, property values, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I would kind of push back a little bit on Poe's definition here, where the city in this context is very neutral, right? And we just need to place industrial use somewhere. I think we have to be very clear that there was some, at least from what we see throughout history, a lot of examples of very kind of deliberate behavior in the context of policymakers to target particular communities with these more detrimental land uses. And so I'm going to use the kind of the classic example here of Austin, Texas. And this relates back to the 1928 plan for Austin, in which East Austin is designated for the African American or Black population. And then as part of this process, we see kind of this rezoning of East Austin to kind of on a widespread basis to accept industrial uses. Right? And so early on, we then see kind of how this rezoning then would kind of reorient more intense land uses, more detrimental kind of industrial use over into East Austin, while simultaneously what I would call more kind of beneficial infrastructure heads over into West Austin, the finest parks, for example, better transportation improvements, water and sewer upgrades, all those things that we know are really critical for neighborhood vitality and quality of life. And so eventually then we see over time a clear kind of differentiation between the two sides of Austin, not just in the racial and ethnic populations, but actually in the built environment characteristics of these neighborhoods because of this particular example of expulsive zoning. And so when we talk about expulsive zoning, I'm mostly focusing in on industrial uses here in forms of upzoning, but also to note too that these practices often overlapped with discrimination in public services in terms of how cities expanded their infrastructure from that perspective. And again, just a great case study of this from Professor Whitmore in his 2017 article looking at Durham in North Carolina. And as I will kind of just point out here, Professor Whitmore finds a statistical difference in terms of the racial characteristics of areas that are downzoned versus areas that are upzoned. And in fact, finds that this kind of statistically significant relationship between race and upzoning is most prevalent during 1945 and 1984, kind of pre the environmental justice movement. So a great example of some empirical research that has kind of moved beyond just the anecdotes, but empirically shown how these racial forms of racial discrimination happen in the context of upzoning. And I'm going to give you a more just kind of conceptual example. This is not empirical, but just to give you kind of an idea of these dynamics in the context of where I live here in Columbus, Ohio. The map I'm showing you on the right-hand side is the current map from the EPA, showing the risk screening environmental indicators. These are what are known as RSEIs, and this is the EPA's index of potential health risks from toxic pollution or toxic polluters and the geography of that pollution. So the existence of one of those little circles and the size of the circle and the intensity of the color of the circle tells you that there's more accumulated health risk in those particular areas. And as you kind of look at the map of Columbus, you do see some geographic patterns, particularly on the south side of the city, on the west side of the far west side of the city, and what's here in kind of the near northeast. So what I'm going to suggest to you is that these patterns in the context of our contemporary environmental risks in Columbus have been impacted by many of these historical factors as well as policy decisions related to zoning. So again, excuse the poor quality of these maps. These are very, very old images. But looking at the 1937 Columbus zoning ordinance, for the most part, if you look and focus in on areas that are blue and purple, those are the areas that are explicitly targeted for manufacturing or industrial use. And for the most part, and this is kind of looking at studies that were done of the city and its land use practices in the early zoning days for Columbus, the zoning ordinance really kind of reflected a lot of the existing land use patterns. But by the time we get to the 1950s, we begin to see, and I'm sorry, this is also a very poor quality map, but particularly if you kind of look at the very dark areas on the map where industrial zoning kind of spreads, we see again, kind of out here on the west side, this expansion into the kind of the northeast, further expansion east in the context of kind of the east side, and on the south side, areas which happen to be our most racially diverse and economically diverse parts of the city, where we saw kind of an expansion of manufacturing use. And in fact, when Harlan Bartholomew's planning firm studied land use for Columbus in the 1950s, one of the criticisms that came out of that was the overextension of upzoning for heavy industry and more intense commercial activities on the south side of the city and the east side of the city, which again happened to be where most of the racial and ethnic populations that were either African American or first or second generation immigrant were located during this time period. The second part of my talk, and again, this goes into Professor Pendle's discussion about policy changes at the federal level in the 1930s, is to reflect kind of with some local context, the process of redlining and what that really meant for many of these neighborhoods that were redlined. Now, as we've discussed in these historical readings over time, really talked about kind of the growth of suburbia, particularly those first suburbs, or excuse me, those inner suburbs in the 1920s, et cetera, and what happens to those neighborhoods. Future discussions, we'll talk about kind of what happens in the post-war period with the growth of suburbia and the rapid expansion of suburbia being protected by both zoning ordinances, but also incentivized by a lot of federal policy and spending at this time period. But I want to kind of refocus back in on some of these neighborhoods that may have also been impacted by expulsive zoning, but were redlined. And just to give you some context as to kind of what the diversity of neighborhoods that were redlined, as well as kind of the trajectory of what happens to these neighborhoods over the long term. The image on the left-hand side of the screen is something that is pretty standardized in the context of our Holk assessments in the 1930s, and this is an area description write-up. And you'll see is kind of very typical as a real estate assessment document. There's a lot of very kind of common information on here that you would think would make sense, you know, sales prices, you know, looking at occupancy levels, et cetera, but of course, as we know about redlining and its racially discriminatory impact, racism was heavily embedded in the context of the structure of these assessment documents, particularly as we looked at discussions around infiltration, the targeting of foreign-born and African-American population as a category in here to influence the assessment, and this discussion around favorable and detrimental influences. And so to help kind of get some understanding as to kind of what these real estate assessors were thinking, what informed their assessment decisions, I'm going to share a case study that I did here at Ohio State for the Society of Planning History, where we did a content analysis of all of the cities in Ohio and all the assessment documents in Ohio for cities that were redlined, where we have access to the assessment documents. So this does not cover Columbus and Cincinnati, where unfortunately we have lost copies of the original assessment documents, but does cover most of the state's urban areas to give you a feel for kind of what kind of factors are really emphasized in the written comments in the assessment documents. So we'll start kind of talking about the upper end of the Holk assessment scale, which are our green and blue areas in the map, our A and B grade areas. And again, as we kind of talk about this, I want to really provide you some context just thinking about who performs these assessments and what the assessments really reflect. Faber wrote a piece in recent years looking at kind of the role of Holk and redlining assessments, and noted that one of the things that is important in the context of Holk is that these Holk assessments are really a reflection of the predominant forms of racism, anti-Semitism, and discrimination that were just norms in the real estate industry during this time period. And in fact, if you go through assessment documents and you actually see who the assessors were that informed the documents, most of these folks who were actually writing these assessments up or doing these neighborhood assessments were local real estate professionals, sometimes working in consultation with the Holk assessors, sometimes working as contractors or agents of Holk in this context. So really, as you read these documents, these are insights from the local real estate community, and it gives us a very clear view of how real estate stakeholders were really kind of thinking during this time period, and the way they valued different types of neighborhoods, and the way discrimination informed their views of neighborhoods. So the first thing to note as we look at these kind of A and B areas, the areas that are given more positive ratings, we do see certain discussions around land use, and I referenced this in our week 2 materials. Very rarely do we see discussions explicitly talking about zoning, but we often find a lot of references to residential restrictions, right? And these are often referring to residential deed restrictions via covenants, and in particular, who can move into neighborhoods because of restrictive covenants. In occasional cases here, in the context of our Ohio assessments that we studied, you would also see restrictions on different forms of public facilities as being a positive thing. For example, park facilities that were, let's say, not accessible to the African-American community. And that would be lifted up in an assessment as a positive trait for this predominantly white neighborhood. There are some references to planning and kind of urban design characteristics of these neighborhoods, particularly A-rated neighborhoods. And while high quality housing is often commonly referenced in these discussions across these various Holk documents, references also speak to things like landscaping, tree cover, and natural amenities. And as you see from this quote from Akron, really kind of a very clear endorsement of these beautifully landscaped kind of garden suburbs that exist outside of Akron, and that this is kind of the ideal landscape and therefore gets the top rating or assessment. But you also see in the context of A and B areas, a lot of discourse around who lives in these areas and the social context. Primarily our A areas, you'll see a lot of content that really talks about the exclusivity of these areas. Just to kind of paraphrase a few of these quotes here, the highest type doctors and surgeons reside in this area. An area that includes the younger element of professional and high salaried men, occupied exclusively by wealthier citizens, right? And so there is a clear nod to kind of the social exclusivity of these spaces as being very beneficial and kind of supporting why these areas are upgraded. In our B areas, we see some concerns about infiltration, and this is a common thing that we would see across these assessments. And these concerns would be almost really kind of very minute aspects of diversity in a neighborhood being seen as this kind of threatening situation, right? So to just give you some examples here from assessments across the state, in the context of Cleveland neighborhood, where we see just a few Danish families being kind of a warning sign and seen as a reason enough to downgrade the neighborhood to a B area. Concerns about African-American children walking through a neighborhood to reach a school. And also even things such as kind of ethnic churches being within a neighborhood as being seen as kind of a detrimental land use because of the people it would attract to it. And so again, you see the way kind of wealth and discrimination really kind of intermixed in the context of how assessors view these neighborhoods that they upgrade. This takes us to the other side of the spectrum of the real estate assessments, the yellow and red areas, which are kind of given the lowest grades, and these are our C and D areas on the Holk maps. In general, if we talk about the physical characteristics of these neighborhoods, we see a lot of references to infrastructure, either the existence of it or where it's missing. A lot of references to industry, and industry was probably one of the most commonly referenced detrimental influences. So again, kind of reflecting back, if you think about the growth of expulsive zoning practices, and let's say the expulsive zoning practices kind of pick up in the 1920s, by the time these assessments are done, kind of the impact of kind of upzoning and the prevalence of industry in particular neighborhoods is going to contribute to that neighborhood being downgraded. Finally, as we kind of talk about the built environment, some references to housing maintenance problems, but this was There are certainly some neighborhoods across the state, as we looked at kind of major themes of what we found in C&D areas. There were occasionally neighborhoods that are kind of called out for having kind of very poor quality housing. But generally, this wasn't the case. The more common kind of physical characteristics that we see identified as kind of justifying why the neighborhood was downgraded really had to do with their industry, or the existence, lack of existence of certain types of infrastructure. Again, as we go through these assessments in our content analysis across the state, references to the built environment are really overshadowed in relation to references to the social environment. And this is where we see kind of social, racial, ethnic conditions in neighborhoods taking up really kind of far more bandwidth in the actual assessment documents, particularly in the written comments in terms of explaining why these neighborhoods are downgraded. Very kind of rampant racism, of course, very explicitly targeting the Black population. And these are direct quotes from the assessment documents and some of the discriminatory language within these documents. So I do want to recognize that this discriminatory language is incredibly problematic, but to be historically accurate, I do want to share with you the direct quotes that are in these policy documents. For the most part, in our analysis, any neighborhood that had African-American residents was almost always given a D grade. What we did see in the context of neighborhoods is that a fair amount of xenophobia is also very kind of evident in this context. Now, xenophobic phrases are generally kind of seen more in C grade areas, the yellow areas on the map. But also you see kind of a real nexus of both racial discrimination, discrimination against immigrants, and also anti-Semitism in the context of the social discourse and in the assessment documents. And finally, as we think about kind of this idea of, in particular, racial separation as it is influenced by these various forms of zoning and planning restrictions or deed restrictions, the real latent fear of intermixing of racial and ethnic groups. So as kind of we see here in the case of Dayton, this idea of white and Black populations, particularly lower income populations, intermingling is seen as just inherently problematic and therefore justifying why a neighborhood is redlined or downgraded in these Holk assessments. So I present all that to you just to give you an idea across the various cities in our state that were assessed and what types of factors were actually in the minds of these real estate professionals. And very clearly, as you can see, the way that racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, this fear of intermixing or integration of any form clearly kind of left a mark on these assessment documents, and then would have informed where these Holk grades or what Holk grades were for various neighborhoods. For the second part of this talk, I want to focus in on a few cases here in Columbus in particular, where we have some actually some really interesting kind of archival historic photography of some of the neighborhoods that were redlined that also gives us a view then of kind of the physical conditions of these neighborhoods. And I also want to illustrate here just the diversity of neighborhoods that are downgraded or redlined, red or yellow lined in this context in the case of Columbus. So the first neighborhood I'll focus on here is Flytown, which is a neighborhood that no longer exists in the city. It was destroyed by the construction of the I-670 inner belt. And this is photography from Flytown a few years before the assessments would have been done. And this photography is actually from a master's thesis by a geography student at Ohio State in the 1920s, and gave us a really kind of robust set of archival photographs, kind of at the landscape scale, where we can really kind of see what the fabric of these neighborhoods look like at this time. So as we think about Flytown, this is kind of the quintessential neighborhood that many folks think about when it's redlined. Flytown was racially mixed at this time. There were both Irish immigrants here, as well as a very large African-American population. Housing quality was poor in Flytown as a whole. And Flytown had a lot of infrastructure issues. And so as you note here, there still are not paved roads in Flytown at this time, as you can see. Or as you see kind of from this photograph here, I'll kind of give a nod to some of the outhouses, and you can see right here in the right-hand corner. So it was missing in many ways kind of just basic sewer infrastructure, for example. So clearly some very kind of intense problems in terms of the built environment, but also then this nexus of built environment challenges, proximity to industry, and of course the racial and ethnic characteristics of the neighborhood, probably influencing why this neighborhood is downgraded. Second neighborhood I'll look at here is the Steeltown neighborhood, which is on the city's south side, far south side. And again, this was a relatively young neighborhood at the time that the whole grades were pulled together. This was very much a working class community. It was kind of a hub of immigrant populations coming in, African Americans moving in from the South, European immigrants from Eastern Europe in particular, and also then Appalachian immigrants coming up from West Virginia and Kentucky during this time period to find employment in some of the industries at this time. This was again very, very modest housing, but relatively new. Most of this housing was built in the 15 to 20 years prior to the assessment being done. So not a neighborhood necessarily that was lacking resources, infrastructure. It's typical working class immigrant and African-American neighborhood during the time period. But again, because of the racial and ethnic diversity within the neighborhood and its proximity to industry, sorry for this, my internet connection actually just crashed, so we'll continue the rest of our recording. Going back to our discussion around Bronzeville, Bronzeville again is on the Near East side of the city, and is really the hub of the African-American community at this time. Bronzeville is a very kind of unique neighborhood in terms of its economic vitality during this time period. And as I'll kind of demonstrate to you in the context of just looking at some of the conditions within Bronzeville, although Bronzeville gets the absolute lowest rating, a D rating, a fourth grade rating in the context of the Holk assessment, the actual conditions in the neighborhood at this time were actually quite good. This neighborhood was probably one of the more economically kind of vibrant areas within the city. And as we kind of walk through just kind of getting a view of what Bronzeville looked like, this was part of the very large business district that had really a combination of both Jewish-owned businesses and African-American owned businesses, and a very, very kind of substantial business district that included all types of services ranging from hospitals to hotels, music venues, grocery stores, And really, for the most part, most of the folks who lived in this Near East Side community at this time could kind of get access to most services they needed during this time period. Although some parts of Bronzeville had some kind of lower quality housing, much of the housing stock was actually quite high quality. And just kind of a snapshot here of kind of one of the residential streetscapes in the Bronzeville area at this time. Great connectivity in terms of the streetcar system. And so, compared to a place like Flytown, which very clearly had very challenged housing conditions, Bronzeville does not have this kind of characteristic in the context of the neighborhood. Had an abundance of social services. We see here on the right-hand side is the St. Clair Hospital, which was built by the African-American community. And also then over on the left-hand side, one of the social service centers for African-American women who are new to the city, maybe who had recently relocated as part of the Great Migration. And so you had this combination of many services for the community that really didn't exist anywhere else in the city at this time period. And finally, a very vibrant cultural and art community at this time in Bronzeville. On the left-hand side is a snapshot of the Lincoln Theater, which was also funded by the African-American community internally in terms of the financing and the construction of this theater. This theater would be kind of the hub of culture for the community, and in reality was really kind of the, I would say, one of the areas of probably the most intense cultural vitality in terms of arts and music in the city at this time period. And during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s, would see kind of a lot of premier musicians come in and other acts and entertainers come into this space. And at one time, kind of Mount Vernon Avenue, which was kind of at the heart of the commercial corridor, was just filled with clubs that were jazz clubs that would run all night from the perspective of the area. And finally, as kind of we think about Bronzeville in terms of its cultural identity, a very vibrant community during this time period. The tragedy of kind of what happens to Bronzeville is that we see, in essence, these whole assessors downgrade a neighborhood that is highly functional, economically vibrant, culturally rich. And that downgrade was really in relation to the racial and ethnic characteristics of the neighborhood, right? Because it was a Black community, because it was racially intermixed, because of the Jewish population that lived there, and can see this is exactly what motivates assessors during this time period to downgrade the Bronzeville neighborhood. The last thing I would note is that actually, if you look at the historic green books that were printed for travel for African Americans across the nation in the context of Columbus, most of the listings in Columbus, I would say probably north of 80 or 90% of the listings in the green book where Black travelers could feel safe, whether it's hotels, hospitals, restaurants, auto shops, et cetera, almost all of those entities were located in the Bronzeville area in the Near East Side during this time period. So Bronzeville is redlined. And what I want to reference here is that despite Bronzeville being redlined, the community was actually quite resilient for several decades after this redlining happened. Bronzeville used various forms of internal capital building to kind of finance much of kind of the residential and commercial construction in the neighborhood in this time period. So religious organizations, in particular, some social organizations, Masonic organizations, were many of the primary financiers of commercial activities in the community. And for some time, this model to kind of bring capital into the neighborhood that was local, really, to organize local capital within the neighborhood, to fund kind of development, business activity, and commercial activity was sustainable and successful. But as we kind of see the longer term trajectory of the neighborhood, we begin to see kind of cracks in the vitality of Bronzeville, primarily because of other policy factors that would come into play that would harm the neighborhood. The first being that Bronzeville, like many neighborhoods that are redlined, is one of the areas that is prioritized by urban renewal projects. Columbus at this time has an urban renewal initiative in the 1950s that if you very kind of neatly kind of take the urban renewal areas of Columbus and you take the old redlining map, they fit right on top of each other. And our urban renewal initiative, known as an acronym called SCAR, Slum Clearance and Revitalization, I believe, heavily targeted Near East Side. And so there was very intensive demolition on the Near East Side because of this, which proved very problematic to the neighborhood moving forward. And finally, kind of adding insult on the injury, not only was the neighborhood then targeted for urban renewal, but kind of the largest kind of acquisition of land for the inner city highway system occurs on the Near East Side in Bronzeville. And here you see the I-70, 71, and 670 highways all kind of merging together outside of downtown, ripping right through the Near East Side. You can just see the massive kind of scarring of the landscape there in terms of land area in the neighborhood that was taken. Bronzeville lost a lot of its residences at this time, then it lost a significant number of businesses, and it was then kind of disconnected from the rest of downtown by the highway system. Desegregation efforts in the 1960s would see kind of a change in the context of Bronzeville, with many of the more affluent African-American residents leaving and moving further east as different discriminatory housing barriers were lifted. And so again, kind of we look at Bronzeville today, we see a neighborhood that was redlined, but that story about redlining is not as kind of simplistic as what we tell, right? It was redlined, but the community was quite resilient, even in the face of redlining. But it would be the accumulation of these discriminatory policies over time, which would eventually cause kind of widespread disinvestment and population loss in the Bronzeville community. Again, you're looking at two buildings that were in the Green Book and kind of their current condition at this point in time. I just want to note and acknowledge that Bronzeville, or as it's today referred to as King Lincoln, is seeing a renaissance like many urban neighborhoods. And so now, after kind of signs of disinvestment, after this legacy of disinvestment, we begin to see kind of fears of gentrification now in the context of this neighborhood. So I present you this case study just to give you kind of more of a longitudinal view of what happens to neighborhoods after redlining, the interplay between these residential restrictions, activities like expulsive zoning, and then redlining, and then the other kind of policy issues such as urban renewal, highway construction, et cetera, that would, in the long term, prove extremely detrimental to neighborhoods like Bronzeville. To close out this lecture, a couple of just reflection questions I would suggest for you to reflect upon. The first, thinking about expulsive zoning. Right? So we talked about expulsive zoning and the process of how this works. So as you kind of reflect upon expulsive zoning, how does expulsive zoning then impact the quality of life in neighborhoods? What are the exact impacts of expulsive zoning in this context? And as we discuss kind of neighborhoods post-redlining, what factors influenced redlining grades, kind of reflecting upon our content analysis of assessments here in Ohio? And finally, how did neighborhoods decline, or what aspects of neighborhood resiliency do you see in the aftermath of redlining? And reflect back upon kind of this experience on the Near East Side with the Bronzeville community and thinking about that question. Once again, thank you for your time. I'm always happy to follow up with questions that you have or any other points of clarification. And thanks again.